This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Foreign aid accounts for 1% of the U.S. federal budget. That's according to the International Rescue Committee. These funds are used to fight famine and disease worldwide. Early this morning, the Senate cut $7.9 billion in foreign aid funding, and now the future of humanitarian work is unknown. Today, we get an update on humanitarian crises and international conflicts around the globe. Up first, we hear from the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. Their federal funding was rescinded in July. Joining us is Nathaniel Raymond. He's the executive director of the Research Lab. Nathaniel, welcome back to Where We Live.
Good morning.
And listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Nathaniel, can you give us an idea of what happened in July? What happened to the federal funding?
Well, going back to the start of the second Trump term, our program, which was part of the State Department's conflict observatory program, documenting war crimes in Ukraine and in Sudan, was paused along with the entirety of U.S. development, humanitarian, and foreign assistance. In February, we were notified that we were being terminated while we were in the middle of tracking abducted children from Ukraine that were taken to Russia. We were eventually under pressure from Republicans in Congress and the evangelical community. We were reinstated to complete the transfer of our data to Europol. But then we found out that there was $8 million for us to be extended for another year in June. That is now being withheld and rescinded by the Trump administration. So since basically June, we have had no federal funding.
And how much funding do you typically get from the federal government?
It varies year to year, but since 2022, it's ranged between $3 to $5 million.
And so this is basically funds that, of course, funds your research and the staff as a part of the lab. And we'll get into more details about the data that you do collect, but much of your work has to do with collecting data from conflicts happening abroad. Can you give us a better idea of what this looks like and how are you able to collect all of the data?
Well, our primary mission had been trying to locate, count, and identify by name children from Ukraine who were taken by Putin's government illegally to Russia. And so we're in a race against time to find where these children are inside Russia. And so what our work looks like is sort of two big streams. One involves what's called open source information, which is getting basically information from the Russian internet primarily, in putting that together investigatively to find out how many children are being held where and what their names are. But the second part is using very high resolution satellite imagery collected 450 miles above the Earth's surface to monitor the camps where they're being held and the buses and planes that are being used to move the children around Russia. So it's really a combination of internet-based investigation with imagery analysis from satellites.
Well, and I want to get into how the data is being utilized, but because you mentioned this is one of the biggest projects that the lab is conducting, which is researching the coerced adoption of Ukrainian children. Explain what's happening to the children of Ukraine. What happens when they are taken away?
Well, so the place to start is basically at the full-scale invasion in February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they began moving children from areas that were newly occupied, such as Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, and Kherson, to camps inside Russia for re-education. Now, they've been doing that since 2014 in places like Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, which they had occupied before the full-scale invasion. But what we were able to document by examining three interconnected sets of Russian adoption databases is that not only were they taking these children into Russia temporarily for re-education, they were moving many to fostering an adoption with Russian families and giving them Russian passports, and in some cases, changing their names. And what we discovered is that basically our internal estimate, which we're working to confirm with the Ukrainian government, is that at least 35,000 children, ranging from 8 months of age at time of capture to 17 at time of capture, are spread out over more than 100 locations over an area of 3,500 miles from the Black Sea to the Eastern Pacific, including in Siberia. And so this is the single largest child kidnapping since World War II, when the Nazis took Polish children and, quote, Germanified them, uh, uh, destroying their birth certificates and changing their names.
And this clearly has a very large scale that you're speaking about. And earlier you mentioned that some of the ways that you're able to collect data from conflicts is using satellite imagery and open source information. So is it a mix of what you just described? And I imagine you have people on the ground. You know, how are you able to
No one on the ground.
Okay. So
we do it entirely remotely. We work specifically on targets and environments where they can only be accessed remotely. So we specifically focus on non-permissive environments, and that's why the State Department brought us in to do this work.
And what has been the impact of this research?
It helped catalyze 2 international criminal court indictments against Vladimir Putin himself and Maria Lvova-Belova, the Child Rights Commissioner of Russia. And there could be additional indictments to come. Most importantly, what our 3 reports on the children have done is provided the Ukrainian government with critical information, intelligence that helps them across 3 lines of effort. One is that Ukrainian government agencies combined with civil society are working to find where the kids are and sneak them out of Russia to exfiltrate them. So our information supports groups, including the government, that are doing live rescue efforts. The second is that some of these children are being negotiated for as part of negotiations that were going on before the Trump-backed Ankara process on a bilateral peace negotiation to end the war. But our information helps inform negotiations for release of the children through that process. The third thing is that it gives us really important information about the scale of the problem that helps Ukraine and the international community design reintegration and psychosocial support services for the kids who come back. Now, so far, only about 1,400 have come back, but given Ukraine's current situation where they have only a few hundred child psychologists for the whole country, even that small amount of 1,400 that have come back have strained Ukraine's resources, and they need a lot more help. So we help basically provide them information about the scale of the problem and specific demographic information about the kids who've been taken.
And I think you've been with some of the child psychologists, and with the scale that you just share with us, about 1,400 children who have been returned or released. What have you learned about how they've been impacted mentally and emotionally?
Oh, I've been with some of the kids and gotten to talk to them. They're highly traumatized, and they're traumatized for multiple reasons. But for some of the kids, they were taken directly from their parents in what were called filtration camps. After the fall of Mariupol, parents were separated from their children in some cases in these basically concentration camps and interrogation sites that were set up to quote filter Russian Ukrainians from anti-Russian Ukrainians ostensibly. And so some children were directly taken from their parents. In the case of other groups, that were in institutional settings. They were children that were in the custody of the Ukrainian state, as was the case of the Kherson baby home, where over 40 infants were taken directly by Russian combat forces, and it was seen on camera, on CCTV camera at the Kherson baby home, were taken directly. And so, in some cases, the children don't even have a memory of being Ukrainian. But for others, they end up in, specifically older boys, teenage boys, they end up in military training, as was the case of many of the older, about 15 to 17-year-old boys. And so there's a lot of different types of psychological impacts because there's a lot of different types of experiences for the children to go through the program.
And is it part of the lab's work to sort of continue supporting them, or what is it like after they receive perhaps that initial psychological support?
Well, the lab's mission is to find them. We have one mission and one mission only. We are the hunters. And so our job is to identify where the children are, how many of them there are, how they got there, and when we can, their names. And so in December, we presented to the United Nations Security Council the results of our investigation inside the databases, which we realized the databases were basically booby-trapped to detect foreign actors such as ourselves, to be able to, for the Russian security services to basically see what data investigators, both law enforcement, open source investigators, were interested in, and that in some cases could cause the data to disappear. So our role is a very dangerous one in the sense that we're having to move without detection to prevent the data from being destroyed because they're moving the children around. They're trying to conceal their locations. So that's really our task, is to find them when they're being hidden like a shell game.
Well, and on top of that, too, in addition to this work in Ukraine, you've also been monitoring Sudan since their civil war started in 2023. The International Rescue Committee, which is a humanitarian aid organization working in more than 50 countries and also across the U.S., is describing the situation in Sudan as a humanitarian catastrophe of historic proportions. And this also includes extreme famine. Yet I think in some ways this is sort of a lesser-known conflict in the globe. Can you describe where you concentrated your research for this conflict?
Well, our research for the past year is focused on Darfur, and specifically North Darfur, where the capital, what could be called the capital of the Darfur region, has been under siege by Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group fighting the Sudan Armed Forces, the ostensible army of the Sudanese government. And basically, this area, which includes several internally displaced persons camps, plus this giant city, that's, as big a population, if not bigger, than Gaza in that area, has been under siege for since last spring. And so we warned the Security Council, the UN Security Council in July 2023, that El Fasher would be attacked, and that Zamzam internally displaced persons camp, the largest camp for people fleeing the genocide in Darfur, was going to be destroyed most likely. And unfortunately, in April of this year, we were able to detect the attack on Zamzam camp, which sent between 500 to 750,000 people running for their lives. What you've got to understand in Darfur is that many of the people have been starved for so long and without potable water and medical assistance that when they're forced to flee, that's a death sentence. And so we watched from space as civilians poured out onto the road, and we got credible reports as they tried to reach another safe haven that they were so weak that many of the people were just walking to the side of the road and dying.
Well, I think we're scraping the surface of what your lab does, and you're describing some very impactful work that the lab has done with worldwide implications. And since we mentioned earlier that funding has been cut, how has that impacted your ability to continue to work and collect data about what's happening abroad?
It's the equivalent, Catherine, of living off credit cards. We have, with the help of Hillary Rodham Clinton, she put out an appeal and has assisted us in catalyzing online support and individual donor support. So we have enough money to at least make it across our Ukraine and Sudan programs to October. And we're the lucky ones. We're the lucky ones. Even though we're running on fumes, we're still alive. For our colleagues in the humanitarian sector, both within UN agencies and then US NGOs and local organizations, it's been the meteor hitting the earth. It has been a extinction level event. I would say roughly 7 out of every 10 people in our field have lost their jobs since January. And that's sad, but that's not the real tragedy. The real tragedy is that people are already dying because of the lack of US funding, which represented the underpinning of the entire global humanitarian system. And now that's gone.
Well, and as you're facing the fumes and navigating through so many areas of unknown, what will happen next with the lab? Without this funding, how will your work go forward?
I don't know. I get on a plane before dawn tomorrow to go out to fundraise on the West Coast. I would love to be doing my job, Catherine, which is research. But right now, like so many other leaders in the humanitarian field at the organizational level, we're just singing for our supper. And so we're hoping that European governments are going to come and replace the US money. But what's so frustrating here is our money's sitting there in a bank account. It's sitting there. And that's the case for so many organizations, as you may have heard in the past few days. There's over $1.5 million approximately of food that's already paid for. That's now being incinerated by the US government because there's no one to ship it or to manage it. And so what began as the supposed attack on fraud, waste, and abuse has ended up being fraud, waste, and abuse. And the casualty are the most vulnerable people in the world. In the case of Sudan right now, where there's, let's call it integrated phase classification 5, the highest level of famine, you have feeding programs in places like Khartoum shut down with no notice and then turned back on, then shut back down because America doesn't have clarity on what it's doing now, except being cruel to the poorest and most needy people on earth.
And while you sort of continue on figuring out what the future of the lab is like, how will you preserve your databases and data sets that you've collected over the years? Is that something that you can still do?
Well, when we got reinstated by Secretary Rubio, he did a press conference on a plane flight he was on over the Caribbean to Jamaica, and he came out and reversed course on us being allowed to stand back up to be paid by State Department to preserve our data on Ukraine, not just on the kids' cases, but also on over 13 cases we've worked on for the State Department. And so he announced that we would be able to transfer the data to Europol, the law enforcement service of the European Union, and to our Ukrainian partners. That happened at the beginning of June. And we're talking, terabytes of data and critical satellite imagery, and we were able to transfer that. So that's now in the hands of the European Union and the Ukrainians. So if we don't make it beyond October 1st, we've at least gotten our data safe so it can be used by law enforcement. The question is, what it's going to take to make sure that we can build data preservation for future collection for as long as we last. That I don't know the answer to.
And that's certainly something that we're going to be exploring throughout the hour today, but sounds like you're going to stay at Yale.
Oh, we aren't running. We aren't going anywhere. Our goal right now, we are in it to win it. We are not giving up, and we are going to find a way. Do I know what the way is? No. Are we going to find it? Yes.
Well, we're going to continue to parse the way throughout the conversation today. With us today is Nathaniel Raymond. He's the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health, and he'll be staying with us for the hour. And if you have a question about the future of humanitarian aid and what's happening overseas, give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, the Senate voted to cut $7.9 billion in foreign aid spending. Today, we're exploring the local impacts of those federal funding cuts and get updates on international conflicts around the globe. Joining us now is Pravash Budden. He's a Deputy Senior Vice President of Emergency Programs with AmeriCares based in Stanford. Pravash, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
And also with us is Lila Hassan. She's an independent investigative journalist. Lila, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And also still with us is Nathaniel Raymond, who is the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. So Pravash, you've been listening to the conversation and following what's been going on today. Can you respond to what happened this morning with the Senate?
Yes. I've worked in the humanitarian sector for over 28 years, living and working in places like Iraq, Sudan, Gaza, Colombia. And I've never seen global health more at risk than it is today because of these cuts. Everyone deserves access to quality health care, yet billions of people around the world still don't have the resources that they need. These cuts are devastating, and it's going to impact millions of people around the world. Just a few weeks ago, there was a new Lancet study, medical journal, that estimates that U.S. aid over a 20-year period between 2001 and 2021 saved 92 million lives. So there's positive work being done through U.S. government resources over time. Alarmingly, though, it also warns that by dismantling U.S. government resources, there could be up to 14 million preventable deaths just over the next 5 years into 2030. And for comparison, that's roughly the same number of civilians killed in World War I in nearly the same amount of time. So this is a tremendous impact in the global system of humanitarian assistance and longer-term development. Some of the positives that came out from U.S. government resources that everyone should be aware of is that programs were associated over that 20-year period with a 15% drop in overall mortality. And for children under 5, the reduction was even more dramatic at 32%. And in countries with strong U.S. aid support, HIV/AIDS deaths fell by 65%, while deaths from malaria and neglected tropical diseases dropped 50%. So you can see that huge impact of good that took place. Yet, as you pointed out, that resource is 1% of the U.S. federal budget, yet accounts for 40% of global humanitarian assistance. And just in the matter of weeks and days, that carpet's been pulled out from under millions of people around the world who require humanitarian assistance in health and education and livelihoods and shelter. So, what we're seeing right now is a numbers game with health being impacted in an unthinkable way. And we at AmeriCares are concerned about the future of global health. We have a strong network of clinical partners around the world that we work with, local health providers that are deeply rooted in their communities. However, the work that they do is at risk because of federal resources that do trickle down to them through national governments and NGOs, the UN itself. And we do what we can to support them, but we are working in an environment in which it's just becoming harder and harder to deliver healthcare across the globe to the most vulnerable communities.
So I do want to touch on the trickle-down effect in a little bit and also get into more details about the longer-term impacts of not providing this aid, especially for the near future. But I just want to point out that earlier this week, we also spoke with Amanda Morgan, who's the Senior Director of Humanitarian Partnerships at Save the Children, which is also a humanitarian aid organization based in Fairfield here in Connecticut. And here's what she shared about the future of foreign aid.
Here at Save the Children, we're deeply concerned by the White House's request to rescind that over $8 billion in foreign aid funding. And that's just after months that it was passed with bipartisan support. Where we go from here is really about confronting the hard truth that governments globally are slashing foreign assistance budgets. And that's going to have an impact on children globally and here in the US as well. So really for Save the Children and industry-wide, we need to do things differently, and there needs to be humanitarian aid reform. So humanitarian assistance really should not be looked at as handouts from the rich to the poor. These are partnerships and investments in shared stability and prosperity.
So Pravash, would love for you to respond to what Amanda just shared. And I think there's some of the things that she mentioned echoed what you just mentioned.
She's absolutely right. This has real life consequences for children and families around the world. Let me give you an example. With government cuts in Colombia, AmeriCares had a program that supported health services, mental health, and health education for 15,000 Venezuelan migrants and other underserved populations in Colombia. This included prenatal care and treatment for potentially deadly infections and other serious health conditions. And so, one of the people that benefited from this is a little boy named Moses, and he was born with cerebral palsy in Venezuela, facing enormous challenges. His family fled to Colombia, and his mother found an AmeriCares clinic in Puerto Carreño, which is on the border. And he was able to get medicine and treatment that he needed, and this is treatment that his family couldn't otherwise afford. However, when funding cuts closed our clinic, Moses had nowhere to go, and no treatment, no medication, no options. And this is just one of many stories that people have and that are affected by these cuts. So this is of concern because when we look at programs throughout the world that rely on the generosity of the U.S. government, coupled with other governments from the European Union, the UN system as well, there is a lifeline that has been in place for decades, and it has now been cut immediately. We all know that there is needed reform within the humanitarian development sector, but there is a lot of critical thinking that has gone into how that can take place, and not just over a day or two, but over a period of time where you can look at more options of localization, getting improved leadership and accountability at the front lines of local organizations, and having large organizations such as US-based NGOs play a more facilitative role of technical assistance. But the way it's been done is not the way that we would expect a quality program to continue, and in a thoughtful manner. So we're concerned about what the future holds with the funding cuts and where people will be able to find assistance, and especially in fragile environments, ones like Sudan that Nathan was pointing to. Apart from the nutritional issues and the malnutrition in Sudan and the famine that is occurring there, there's been an outbreak of cholera in Sudan over the past several months. Now, AmeriCares is responding with support to mitigate spread of cholera in places like Khartoum and portions of Darfur. However, this cholera outbreak can be directly related to the lack of support of fresh water, sanitation services, access to medicine and medical supplies, and the overcrowding in displacement camps that usually with support from NGOs, you're able to track infection as well as mitigate it and implement programs that can mitigate the spread of cholera. All of that is being dismantled right now, and that results in health conditions that are deadly for people. So those are real life examples of what aid cuts mean in places that we don't really hear about so much in the news.
Well, and we've been talking a lot about the impacts globally, but Amanda also mentioned that it happens here in the U.S. as well. So we'd love to get your perspective too in terms of what happens, when it happens here in the U.S.
One of the things we're seeing in the U.S. is also consideration of U.S. support to its emergency support services, namely FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And in the U.S., we're seeing many more natural disasters take place, extreme weather. We've just gone through what we saw in the devastating floods in Texas, as well as tornadoes in the Midwest. We're in the middle of hurricane season right now. And without the type of strong federal support to states, there are communities that are at risk of not having the right emergency information systems in place, the right type of grant systems when disasters do happen, and overall social service supports. And so there is a tremendous impact in what Americans will face if they're not supported by the US government and the resources available to do early warning, preparedness, as well as disaster response. At Americares, we respond to many disasters in the United States, and we work closely with health clinics in affected areas, and many of them, rely on information services as well as federal and state resources to be able to carry out their work, and that is being curbed. And it's of a concern to be able to make sure that Americans stay safe.
So I want to bring in Lila Hassan to the conversation. Lila is an independent investigative journalist, and going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of gathering data. And it sounds like organizations around the world work together. They use the data. Lila, your most recent reporting concentrates on archiving what's happening in Israel and Gaza. How did you first get interested in how this war was being documented?
Well, there was so much in the colloquialisms of the way that people discuss the conflict in saying that this is the most live stream, quote, genocide in the world. It's the most documented conflict in modern history. There have been a lot of taglines that aren't necessarily supported by anything other than experience and just, all around bombardment of how much information and content has come out of Gaza. And so with all of this information kind of sits on social media channels, on big tech companies, we're talking X, Instagram, Facebook, Telegram, WhatsApp. And so when we think about this onslaught of information, I just kind of had this ongoing thought, partly because I used to work in the human rights investigations field, another part because as an investigative journalist myself, oftentimes investigations and work just take months and years sometimes to put together a full picture. And so when I think about that onslaught of information, I was wondering, where will all of this go 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now? And in the pursuit of kind of answering that question, thinking that I would find a quick answer, the investigation kind of unfolded in itself because one breadcrumb led to another of sort of discovering the challenges of archiving, the lack of any sort of obligation or component in international law or even in human code that kind of obligates that work to be done. Oftentimes, archiving is simply just the work of grassroots organizations that grow along the way with funding, support, infrastructure, and resources and the development of expertise. But yeah, for the most part, it arises from an individual person. And so when I was looking for individual people, organizations, even big name organizations that have done this kind of work in the past, I kind of discovered that there are some pretty unprecedented challenges to doing this kind of work: financial, security, legal, logistical, and otherwise.
Well, and actually rolling on to you mentioning some of the unprecedented challenges of archiving information based on what you're seeing, and I'm seeing a lot of parallels between your work and what the humanitarian lab at Yale is doing is sort of piecemealing satellite imagery and open source information, as Nathaniel was sharing earlier. So it sounds like there are some similar challenges here, but you also are working through social media. So can you talk about what are the challenges there, trying to get all the information from social media when oftentimes internet is very, very limited?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely, this is truly, there is more data out there than there is human capacity to actually store it. Like, that is something that is a challenge in and of itself. But ironically, just because of the quantity of information does not necessarily mean that that information can be used in all settings. Archives, like I kind of alluded to earlier, I'll just state it a little bit more outrightly now. There is no international standard for what makes an adequate archive. There is nothing that predicates that, X, Y, and Z components need to be there in order for an archive to have been achieved. It differs from conflict to conflict, from the engagement of the international community, from the engagement of these organizations or individuals that are undertaking this kind of work. And so really the only standards that exist to meet the standard of what's acceptable information are what legal, domestic, regional, and international courts might accept as evidence of war crimes or digital evidence that's authenticated, verified, and able to be used in these settings. The people that are most able to do this kind of work are human rights researchers, legal researchers, and journalists. And for the most part, or entirely, the ones in Gaza are all based in Gaza. And unless they've evacuated, which seems now to be permanently, they are all stuck in Gaza. Gaza, for those that are not familiar, or just to give you an update, is somehow in even worse shape than the last time we spoke, than probably even yesterday. The situation there continues to deteriorate. Both humanitarian assistance is at a complete halt. Starvation is being accused against genocide as being a weapon of war that's being weaponized against the people there. And there is shoddy internet connection because that's been shut off for well over a year now. And so really the ability of these incredibly qualified researchers and journalists to get this information to us is dependent on pretty dire circumstances. I would say that even if a journalist, and this is true according to my reporting, if a journalist or a researcher was to send us information that they've collected that day, the likelihood of what we would receive is probably one of 10 different samples, let's say. And to collect those 10 samples, and this is just a hypothetical number, but to collect that hypothetical 10 number of instances, once upon a time they might have been able to obtain that information in the span of, let's say, 10 to 20 minutes through phone calls or through exchanging messages on social media. None of that is really accessible to them now because of the internet and because the infrastructure of the land is pretty much destroyed. It's an estimated 90% of Gaza's infrastructure. That means streets, buildings, bridges, roads, anything that enables transportation have been destroyed. And so in order for anyone, researcher or journalist, to get to the scene of an incident, we're talking about walking something like 4 or 5 hours one way to get where something might have happened, to eventually come across people that might not even survive to have witnessed the attack. And so really the physical toll of investigating any one incident is nothing like it used to be. It's incredibly tiresome and cumbersome. And let's say that incident that they're going to investigate, that might not be a spot where internet is widely available. That might be another 3 to 4 hours walking to somewhere that they can charge their devices and then going to another area where they're actually able to send that. And unfortunately, really, really convenient modes of digital transportation now, like, let's say, Dropbox or WeTransfer, that's nearly impossible for them to use at this point because that requires such a strong internet connection that they simply don't have. And so really what I've seen journalists and researchers do is that they'll send out samplings of their works to people outside of Gaza to preserve that information for them.
Well, and before we go to break, Nathaniel, I want to ask you to respond here because while not necessarily the same kind of process to get the information, but lots of parallels in terms of relying on technology, can we respond to what we just heard from Lila?
Well, Lila is bringing up a critical point here, and there's two parts to it. One is that right now, many of the frontline investigators in places like Gaza, Sudan, et cetera, are facing the collapse of infrastructure, but they're also facing the collapse of U.S. support for political, diplomatic, and in some cases, physical mechanisms for the preservation of evidence of alleged crimes. And the U.S. has has destroyed, really in the past couple months, the entire infrastructure within the State Department, including on Friday, what's called riffing, which is firing over 1,300 employees, including in places like the Global Criminal Justice Bureau, Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, BPRM, which deals with migration. So all of the U.S. diplomatic and funding support for efforts to collect alleged crimes has gone the way of the dodo in a very short period of time. The second issue here we need to think about is that the U.S. underwrites a large amount of the licenses that provide data streams to organizations like the World Food Program, organizations like UNICEF, that allows them to identify need to identify where aid needs to be targeted. And we've experienced this directly in multiple settings in the past few weeks, is that UN agencies and others who relied on US data flows are coming to us to try to replicate things that were formerly done by organizations like NASA, like the State Department, et cetera, to be able to get real-time weather data, satellite imagery, rainfall data, to be able to target aid. So we have seen really in a very short period of time the collapse of this entire infrastructure of funding, personnel, and expertise that assisted in preserving data, but also moving data to those who needed it most to make life-saving decisions. And the consequences are incalculable.
Today, we're talking about the future of humanitarian aid here in Connecticut and abroad. With us for the hour are Nathaniel Raymond, who's the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health, Pravash Budden, who's the deputy senior vice president of emergency programs at AmeriCares, and also Lila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist. We'll be back after a quick break. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The United States is the largest foreign aid donor in the world. These funds go towards disaster relief, battling HIV, AIDS, and promoting democracy and good governance worldwide. That's according to Pew Research. This morning, the Senate cut $7.9 billion in foreign aid. And still with us to talk about the future of humanitarian aid is Lila Hassan, Nathaniel Raymond, and Pravash Budden. So Lila, I want to start with you here. We ended the last segment talking about sort of the importance of data gathering and archiving data. Any thoughts to finish off there?
Yeah, I mean, Nathaniel said something really interesting about the international community's willpower in supporting this documentation efforts in conflict-affected areas. And that's something that I found in my reporting to be one of the major obstacles for work to be done in Gaza specifically or around Gaza. Like I mentioned, archives are oftentimes the work or the creations of grassroots efforts. But in 2025, actually, we have several pretty esteemed archive organizations that are very well equipped in open source intelligence research and being able to craft incidents through social media and support their work through reporting and getting in touch with people on the ground, even if they themselves are not there. And so there are several organizations that do that. One is Air Wars, that focuses specifically on airstrikes in areas and how that affected, killed, injured civilians. And there's Mnemonic, which has done this kind of specifically archival work for Yemen, Ukraine, and Syria. And so these are organizations with infrastructure, with staff, with their own creation of databases that are supported with softwares that is being paid for. They fundraise, but they're often receiving grants from governments and organizations around the world. The issue that we found, or that I found in my reporting through Gaza and this kind of work on supporting Gaza, is that because there is most of the tech organizations that produce this work kind of take down this work because of U.S. foreign designations of what are terrorists, and Hamas is one of them. And that makes any potential connection to Gaza almost implicitly nefarious, even if that's not the case. It's kind of approaching all of that information with a sense of doubt before believing that it's accurate and usable. And so what that means is that the information is taken down quite quickly, and these archive organizations need to download as many data points as possible to then authenticate and verify later. It's the authentication and the verification that requires manpower, expertise, staff, and support, and that's really what requires financials. However, because of these kind of implicit or suggested ties to terrorist organizations, whether or not they're true, and 99% of the case are not true, So many of these organizations are not able to find fundraising to replicate that work today for what's going on in Gaza. So, it's ironic because this is the most live streamed, the most documented conflict in modern history, and yet it's the one that's financially the least supported, and donors and organizations don't even really want to touch it. I've had pretty explicit conversations with these organizations that have told me we had no problem fundraising for Ukraine, for Yemen, for Syria, but no donor wants to touch this work today. I even spoke with a former U.S. State Department official that did this work in Syria. He intercepted pilot communications with Bashar al-Assad air jets that were dropping bombs on civilians. And he downloaded all of these communications, archived, stored them as evidence of war crimes to be used in international and domestic courts later. And he told me that he would be able to replicate this work in Gaza. He would be able to place Israeli Defense Forces soldiers in the scenes where war crimes might have happened. And the governments that he received funding from before told him pretty outrightly that we're not interested in this kind of work. So
I want to have Pravash respond here as well, because you're both sort of working in very similar situations in terms of humanitarian aid or wanting to get more funding for humanitarian aid. Pravash, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I wanted to comment just briefly on the use of data. Nathaniel laid out the architecture and the financing behind that has decades of U.S. support to be able to have the licenses to set up systems. And the way it plays out on the ground with the UN system and NGOs like ourselves and others is that we need the type of data sets that are gathered on the ground through going out to the field and collecting data through assessment. So this means getting in a car, driving to insecure places, doing interviews, looking at analysis around health, education, livelihood, shelter needs. And without that, we fly blind to be able to deliver the right type of services in the right places at the right time. And without that, people are not going to be able to receive the type of quality care and assistance that the aid community has propped up over decades, be it in Myanmar, be it in the DRC, be it in Gaza, Sudan, Colombia. The aid world is flying blind right now with those cuts to the ability to collect data and provide quality care.
Got about a minute here left. Nathaniel, can you respond to what Lila and Pravash has shared as well?
Nathaniel? Well, what I want to say is to step back for a second. What we're looking at here is that the United States, under the Trump administration, has played a dangerous game of Jenga, and they just ripped the blocks out from under the whole tower. And people need to know, listening today, that foreign aid and humanitarian money is some of the best money the United States has ever spent. But like the tagline from the Las Vegas Tourism Board, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens with these cuts does not stay in Vegas. What we have to understand is we're shooting ourselves in the foot on undermining our own interests and our own security. And the moment we're in now is just the beginning of the cresting of a wave of the underpinnings of global stability that America has invested in for the cost of 2 cups of coffee a year per taxpayer to give us unprecedented global stability. That's gone away now, and now we're going to see the consequences.
Well, this is something that we're certainly going to keep our eyes on. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Nathaniel Raymond with the Yale Public School or School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab. We appreciate your time, Nathaniel.
Thank you.
And also Pravash Budden, who's with AmeriCare. Pravash, appreciate your time as well.
Thank you very much.
And also Lila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist. Lila, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.